I am still sharing my screen. Okay. Testing, testing. I hope this audio works this time. Take like 20. Cool. So, for my historical analysis, I did De Gustibus by Robert Browning. Now, my thesis for this historical analysis is that De Gustibus is a bold argument for living in the moment during a time of complete change in society. I feel like that answers the question of the Victorian age, which is all about transitioning and the change of an era from being like less technological to more so, which is honestly kind of basic at this point for the course. But I find that Degusta was specifically saying that living in the moment and not worrying about that change is what makes this a profound piece. Now, the breakdown of Degusta, before we get into any lines or any like summarizing of the story, the genre is a dramatic monologue, and the purpose, according to Palmer, is the dispassionate study of one's character. But who are we studying? What character are we studying? Robert Browning, I believe, is discussing himself in this. It's a very like he's monologuing to us. It's an open-ended statement that he's telling us how to live and what he believes in. So this is a study of his own character. Now, the setting is in the Apennine Mountains, Italy. It's a concrete setting. There's also the English woods, which is concrete. And underneath the setting, I've added naturalism, which isn't necessarily a setting. Like, naturalism doesn't mean nature, but what naturalism does mean is a style of representation based on accurate depiction and details. So, what I mean by that is if there's a tree, I'm going to say it's a tree. It's a green tree. It's a green tree with brown bark. I'm not going to say the tree stood reaching to the heavens, flowing in the wind. Like it's very simple. This is what it is. This is what it looks like. That is all. It's plain. I think that adds to this poem quite a lot, actually. And we'll get into that later. Now, some of the things to look out for in De Gustibus is aging, death, nature, sublime, and reflection, self-reflection specifically, as it seems as though Browning is talking about himself in this poem. At the top, I've also added a Gustibus dot dot dot. Now, in the title, there is a little hyphen after the name of it, which to me signified that there was more to it. So I looked up De Gustibus, and I got the phrase De Gustibus non est disputandum, which means, give me 1 second. In matters of taste, there can be no disputes, which again leads me to believe that Browning is making a statement. You cannot argue with what he is saying, for what he is saying is real and that is final. Now, let's analyze part one. This poem is broken up into two major sections, two major stanzas. The first taking place in the English wood. Your ghost will walk, you lover of trees. First of all, oh, if our love remains. That's lines one and two. And what I believe that says, like, says instantly, is that there is this idea of death. Your ghost will walk. It says you lover of trees. It mentions the sublime in a way because it brings up nature, although that gets more in depth later. But the idea that there's a ghost and death looming over this poem from line one really adds into what I believe that he is saying. Now we move on to lines five through eight. Hark those two in hazel coppice, a boy and a girl, if the good fates please, making love, say, the happier they. Now, to me, this also like signifies unity. Say they have a boy and a girl love. He's effectively saying like they're youthful. They have no worries for death. They have no worries for this ghost. They're happy because they're simply together. We move on to lines 9 through 13, which say, draw yourself up from the light of the moon and let them pass, as they will too soon, with the bean's flower boons and the blackbird's tune, and May and June. Now, let them pass could be signified as both let them live out their lives, let them be happy, or let them die. Further on with as they will too soon, which makes me feel like they're going to die young. But it also means that they're not going to care that they die because they are happy. They're in the midst of each other, and for that reason, like living in the moment, they do not have that fear of death. The blackbirds signify crows, and May and June also signify crows, actually. And crows being a symbol of death and the afterlife and that transition between the two makes a very clear-cut idea that this poem is handling death and the idea that in the future there will be nothing, or at the very least the transition of life to death, which can be symbolic of the past into the future. Now, in analysis two, I'm not going to go specifically into all of the lines. I have specific ones picked out, which I believe say the most about what Browning is trying to convey. However, it is worth noting that the setting is in Italy at this point now. It's a very barren area with very few trees, and the setting outside of that is this big castle, this small house that's like slowly crumbling, and this big ocean view right ahead of that that's inside of it. Now, line 9 says, "Where the baked cicala dies of drought." Instantly, cicala means cicada, and cicadas, if I look at my notes very quickly, mean rebirth or mean rebirth. Now, drought is drought, and it means that they died of thirst. But this is important, very important actually. So if we look to lines 14 through 18, it says, "The water's edge for what expands before the house, but that great opaque blue breadth of sea without a break, while in the house forever crumbles some fragment of the frescoed walls." There is water there. And as I said in the setting, which isn't listed in these lines, there's an ocean view right outside of the house. So this cicada dying, the symbol of rebirth, dying of thirst, while there's water right there to quench that, means a lot to me. It means what does, I guess it doesn't mean that, but it asks the question, what does the water signify? Blue breath of sea without a break. Now, we've gone over in Dover Beach that ebb and flow of like life, not life per se, but like fate and past moving and changing with the tides. And so to me, the future comes to mind when I think about the ocean, which means what does cicada represent? If that represents rebirth or the recoming into something new in the future, and the future is the water, and it can't get to that future, then what is stopping it? What is happening here? And I believe the answer to that is technology and that transition from where they were in the Victorian age to a future lacking religion and full of new prosperity, but also the struggles of the workforce that we've discussed in class as well. We look back to while in the house forever crumbles, and to me, the house represents memories. It represents the past. Cicada died looking into the water but not getting it because it was trapped in the past. The idea that it cannot transition into this future for whatever reason. Now, think back to what I said about Browning and the idea of living in the moment. Think about the two lovers together in the woods. See that you are only going to be happy if you live in the moment without worrying about the future or the past. And it seems to me that the cicada is in this middle point where it is living in the present, but it dies because of that without ever getting to see the future. And I don't necessarily believe that's a bad thing. When we look at the house, it's forever crumbling with some fragment of the frescoed walls there. There's still a memory of it, but it is also dead because not because it can't reach the water per se, but because it just doesn't exist anymore. This death is a natural cycle that Browning is talking about. Now, we look to the last lines, lines 26 through 33, and this is the big part of the story that is, from what I understand, slightly famous. Um, it is Italy, my Italy. Queen Mary saying, "Serves for me, when fortune's malice lost her callous. Open my heart, and you will see graved inside it Italy. Such lovers old are I and she, so it always was, so shall ever be." And that right there is the epitome of this poem. And it's because Browning really likes Italy, which sounds rather dull at the first, but think about it for a moment. We can only live in the moment. So, what is more in the moment than that self-expression and that passion and screaming out, "Italy, my Italy"? The idea that Browning does not care about the future. He does not care what's going on. He cares that he loves Italy. And that is kind of all it needs to be. We go back to in matters of taste, there can be no disputes. And we have two different tastes. We have England and we have Italy. And he's saying that he prefers Italy. But the idea that he prefers that also comes from the idea that he is living in the moment. He sees what is around him and he loves it for what it is. And he's not worried about Italy in the future. He's worried about what it is inside of him and what it represents to him. And to that, it is happiness. The last line is "so it always was, so shall ever be." And I think that's the key takeaway here. The fact that Italy was Italy before, Italy will be Italy after. What matters is that he's able to enjoy it for what it is when he's around, in the same way that you should be able to enjoy life for what it is while you are still living in it. Now, why is De Gustibus important? Well, one, its use of naturalism in poetry set off a huge wave of naturalism in other poetries, in other works. The use of like as we saw in the other lines, he doesn't necessarily have much imagery. We have the house, it's crumbling, it has a fragment of frescoed walls. We don't know the color of the house. We don't know how dusty it is, if it's cylindrical or if it's a square. We just know what we need to know. It's very simple and very acute, as naturalism is. And I believe that that comes in great handy when it comes to other works and other poems because it allows for that symbolism without getting caught up inside the imagery that surrounds poetry usually. It makes it almost easier to understand, or it can make it harder if you're using that acute detail to put in other meanings and symbols. Now, outside of that, there are the themes of change and how we engage with it. Now, themes of change, as we've discussed in class, are very universal. They are in almost every work we've discussed, at least as far as the Victorian age. And it's very just, it works in any time period. The reason this poem is so famous is because it can apply anywhere, whether future, whether past, whether right now. As long as you are passionate about something, you can scream out, Italy, my Italy, then you're living a life you should be living, at least according to Browning. And if you can't do that, then you need to find that for yourself. And that's kind of the whole point. You can apply this idea on how to live life anywhere you look, any way you live. Now, the reception of this poem was the poem itself didn't really have much of a reception necessarily, but Browning did. Now, he was compared quite often to other poets, and were argued whether or not he was actually great. See, people couldn't decide whether Robert Browning was a master poet or if he was just really, really good. And because I had that back and forth, I find that this poem in specific makes one, an argument for him to be a master. I believe it is a very, very good work. But two, it also leads me to understand that, like, at the time, this is kind of different. I mean, he didn't have any institutions, he didn't have a proper education when it came to being a poet. He just had what he saw and he wrote what he thought. And I believe that's what makes him such a great poet and what makes this such a good work. Though there's that controversy whether or not he should be a master, and it's lasted for ages, apparently, like years beyond his death. What matters now is that I think everyone can agree that this poem does its job in telling us how to live life in a time of transition and almost like screams optimism. To quote actually, anything but optimism is stupid and cowardly. Um, that idea comes again from, if you give me one moment, Palmer in one of his writings. And it's the idea that Browning lives a life where you cannot just refrain from anything. You cannot hold back. You cannot be scared. You need to live a happy life. You need to believe that the best is coming because that is the only way that he views living. And I believe that that resonates a lot in De Gustibus, where there's this overlooming fear of death, the idea that fate doesn't exist, or that if it does in the future does exist, then it will only be bad. And there's only that worry. And then he still screams, Italy, my Italy. He's optimistic all the way through. And I believe that says a lot about De Gustibus and about Robert Browning. Here are my sources. Thank you for listening to my presentation and commenting like I'm sure everyone did already. Um, Let me figure out how to stop sharing my screen now. Oh, also, sorry my camera isn't on. I don't have one on my laptop, which is really annoying. And when I plug it in, it breaks my microphone, so I kind of just gave up midway through.